The sea has always been both a path and a predator. It lures men with the promise of freedom, trade, and adventure, but it also devours without mercy those who dare challenge its dominion. In the mists of the north, when the waves grew restless and the skies bruised with storm, another shape would appear. Long, slender silhouettes cutting across the horizon, their prows carved like dragons, their sails red as blood. To the villagers who first saw them, they were not ships at all. They were omens. They were curses in wood and iron. They were the longships of the Vikings. For centuries, chronicles whispered of these ocean raiders with awe and dread. They came without warning, striking coastal towns like thunderbolts, vanishing before kings could muster their defenses. To some, they were demons born of the sea itself. To others, they were men who had bound themselves to a destiny written in wind and salt, carrying their gods across the waves. Their ships were more than vessels. They were living symbols, the soul of a people whose entire worldview was carved into planks of oak, stitched into sails, and steered by stars. But the story of the Viking longship is not merely about war. These ships reveal something far deeper, how a culture understood power, fate, and the afterlife itself. They were machines of terror, yes, but also chariots of the soul, vehicles through which the Vikings believed they could reach eternity. Just as Egyptian pharaohs built boats for the sun's journey through the underworld, the Norse carved dragon ships to carry both their warriors and their spirits beyond the horizon of life. This is not only history, this is myth, rendered in oak. The longship was a paradox, fast yet steady, simple yet ingenious, brutal yet beautiful. With them, the Norse broke open the world, from monasteries in England to river kingdoms in Russia, from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the gates of Byzantium. And behind every raid, every voyage, every burial mound shaped like a ship, lies the same question. Why did these people see their entire existence reflected in the body of a boat? In this journey, we will follow the keel of the Viking longship, from its birth in sacred forests to its role as both weapon and sanctuary. We will uncover how these vessels were designed not only to conquer seas, but to embody the very soul of the North. And as we peel back the layers of history, we may find that the Vikings, through their ships, carved into the sea the same truth all civilizations have sought, that the way we travel through the world is the way we sail into eternity. Every longship began its life not on the water but deep in the silence of the forest. The Vikings knew that a ship was never merely constructed, it was summoned. Its keel was a tree's destiny turned upside down, its ribs the echoes of branches once lifted toward the sky. In the Norse mind, wood was not an inert material. It was alive, infused with the animating breath of the gods. To cut a tree was to interrupt a sacred dialogue, and to shape it into a ship was to invite that tree into a new cycle of life, no longer rooted in soil, but in the restless sea. The selection of timber was a matter of both skill and reverence. Shipwrights walked among the groves, listening to the creak of branches, the way trunks bent in the wind, the song of wood beneath the axe. Only a tree that had survived storms, that had grown slow and strong, was worthy of becoming a keel. The keel was more than a spine of wood. It was the axis mundi of the ship, the line along which heaven and earth met the sea. Without a perfect keel, no voyage could succeed, and no soul could safely cross into battle or into the afterlife. Once chosen, the tree was felled with a ceremony both practical and spiritual. The Norse had no temples like the stone sanctuaries of the Egyptians or the marble shrines of the Greeks. Their temple was the world itself, the forest, the fjord, the fire. In that open-air cathedral, the sound of the axe striking oak was a liturgy. Every blow was a prayer that the spirit of the tree would not abandon the planks but inhabit them, lending the ship its strength and resilience. The method of construction, clinker built with overlapping planks fastened by iron rivets, was nothing short of revolutionary. Where other ships labored against the sea, the longship seemed to breathe with it. The overlapping design allowed the hull to flex and ripple with the waves rather than resist them, as if the ship itself were alive, adjusting its body to the moods of the ocean. This was not brute force but harmony, an engineering that mirrored the Norse worldview where survival depended not on dominating nature, but on entering into its rhythm. The prow was the soul made visible. To carve it was an act of devotion, and the choice of beast, dragon, serpent, stag, or wolf, was not random. Each represented forces both feared and revered. Dragons, in Norse cosmology, were guardians of treasure and thresholds, creatures that devoured and protected. By placing such a head at the ship's front, the Vikings declared themselves as those who had tamed chaos, riding it across the sea. To enemies, the dragon's eyes were a terror. To the crew, they were a shield. And when the ship returned home, sometimes the figurehead was removed, for to bring its full power into the village was considered dangerous. Even wood carved in the likeness of myth carried power too raw for ordinary life. The genius of the longship lay not only in its beauty but in its versatility. With its shallow draft, it could slip into rivers as easily as it braved the open ocean. No coastline was safe, no monastery hidden inland beyond reach. A fleet of longships could vanish into a fjord, reappear across the channel, and within days be rowing silently up rivers in France or Russia. They were not only ships of war, they were shadows cast across Europe, moving faster than rumor could follow. The psychological impact of such vessels was as devastating as their physical presence. Entire regions lived under the terror of sails suddenly appearing on the horizon, knowing that by the time the alarm was raised, the raiders would already be gone. And yet, to see a longship only as a weapon is to miss half its truth. Its proportions, curved with almost mathematical perfection, were designed not just for speed, but for beauty. Archaeologists who have studied surviving remains like the Oseberg and Gokstad ships speak of an elegance that transcends function. Their lines are graceful, almost musical. The longship was as much sculpture as it was strategy, as much hymn as it was hammer. To step aboard was to be enclosed by art, to stand within a space where geometry and myth fused into one body of oak and sail. The construction of a ship was also the construction of identity. Each rivet, each plank, each carved detail bound men together, reminding them that their lives depended on one another. Just as the planks overlapped, each warrior leaned on the next. In the creak of timber and the rhythm of oars, the Vikings heard the same lesson their sagas taught: no man survives alone. The ship was both a vessel and a covenant, holding not only warriors but a culture's very sense of itself. Thus, when a Viking longship slid into the water for the first time, it was not merely launched. It was baptized. The sea accepted its new companion, and with it, the souls who would ride upon its back. It was not just oak and iron. It was a dragon given wings, a beast set loose upon the horizon. And in its reflection, the Vikings saw themselves, fierce, free, bound to fate, and determined to carve their stories into the waves. To understand the true power of the Viking longship, we must imagine the world before its shadow fell across the coasts of Europe. The 8th century was a time of fragile kingdoms, of monasteries glittering with gold and manuscripts, of towns unguarded by stone walls. Life along the coast was punctuated by the rhythm of trade and prayer. Fishermen pulled in their nets. Monks lit candles before dawn. Farmers carried their goods to markets that had little need for soldiers. It was a world at peace with the sea, until the day the dragon-prowed ships appeared. The first recorded Viking raid struck in 793 at the monastery of Lindisfarne, off the northeast coast of England. Chroniclers tell us that the sky burned with lightning, whirlwinds raged, and dragons were seen in the air. The appearance of the longships was interpreted as a sign of divine punishment, as if God himself had unleashed demons upon the land. In truth, it was the Vikings' mastery of naval technology that allowed them to arrive without warning. The longship was a predator in wood, and the sea was its hunting ground. Imagine the terror of a village when, before dawn, the sound of oars carried across the mist. By the time the alarm bell rang, warriors were already pouring onto the beach, their axes glinting, their shields like a wall of thunder. The ships that delivered them were not anchored far off. They slid right up onto the sand, their shallow hulls kissing the earth as if the sea itself had carried its raiders straight into the heart of the settlement. And when the blood was spilled, the gold taken, the torches lit, the Vikings vanished back onto their ships. By the time the smoke rose high enough to signal for help, the dragon ships were already gone, swallowed by the horizon. But terror was not their only purpose. The longships also transformed the map of the known world. They were the first vessels capable of creating a true network across seas and rivers. With them, the Norse reached not only Britain, but Ireland, France, Spain, and Italy. They sailed down the rivers of Eastern Europe, founding trade routes that reached as far as Byzantium. Archaeological finds tell us that Viking silver came from Arabic lands, their silk from Central Asia, their coins from the Caliphate. What had begun as raiding became trading, and what began as terror became transformation. The longship was both spear and bridge, both destruction and creation. To the Vikings themselves, this duality was no contradiction. Their worldview embraced paradox. The same ship that carried warriors to plunder monasteries also carried ambassadors to distant courts. The same vessel that bore warriors to fiery deaths also carried merchants home with wealth. And when chiefs or kings died, it was in these ships that their bodies were laid to rest, transformed into coffins of eternity. The longship was not simply a machine of violence. It was the vessel of fate. The psychological weight of these ships was immense. To enemies, they represented chaos, the storm given form. To the Vikings, they embodied destiny. A raider stepping onto the deck knew that his life was no longer his own. The sea demanded courage, the ship demanded unity, and the gods demanded sacrifice. In this way, the longship became more than a weapon. It was a crucible of character. Every voyage tested not only the endurance of timber and sail, but the resilience of spirit. We must not forget the artistry of their warfare. The longship was swift enough to retreat when overpowered, maneuverable enough to circle enemies, and silent enough to approach like a ghost. Viking tactics were inseparable from the design of their ships. Where other armies marched on roads, the Vikings flowed along rivers. Where others relied on fortresses, the Vikings relied on speed. It was not only that the Vikings were fierce fighters, it was that their ships rewrote the rules of conflict. They introduced mobility where once there had been static defense, unpredictability where once there had been stability. The longship was innovation wielded like a blade. And so, when we speak of the terror they inspired, we must also speak of the transformation they imposed. The coastlines of Europe hardened because of them. Kingdoms built stronger walls. Cities erected fleets of their own. Trade routes shifted, alliances formed, defenses reorganized. The Viking longship, born in northern forests, reshaped an entire continent's destiny. Yet beneath all of this, the fire, the fear, the fortune, lay something older and more mystical. To the Norse mind, raiding was not merely theft. It was the enactment of a cosmic drama, the playing out of fate decreed by gods like Odin and Thor. The longship was the stage upon which this drama unfolded. To step aboard was to place oneself inside the saga of creation and destruction. Every raid was more than hunger for gold. It was hunger for meaning, for glory, for immortality. And the ship was the doorway through which that hunger passed into history. Thus, the longship was both weapon and womb. It birthed terror in the hearts of its enemies and transformation in the world it touched. It carried death, but also connection. It destroyed, but it also revealed the unity of seas, rivers, and peoples. The dragon ships were not only raiders of the coasts, they were raiders of destiny itself, vessels through which the Norse carved their place in the eternal saga of humanity. If the longship was a weapon in life, it was a chariot in death. Few cultures blurred the line between vessel and soul as vividly as the Vikings. To them, the sea was not only a battlefield, it was the great threshold. the liminal space between the world of men and the realm of gods. And the ship, carved from the bones of trees and infused with breath through wind and oar, was the only bridge strong enough to carry a warrior across. Archaeologists uncovering burial mounds in Scandinavia found not simple graves, but entire ships pulled onto land, filled with the possessions of the dead. Weapons, jewelry, tools, animals, and sometimes even slaves were placed aboard, as if the departed would need them on the far side of the horizon. The vessel itself was the coffin and the key. Its prow pointed toward eternity, its planks sealed not only against waves but against the void. The Oseberg ship burial, discovered in 1904, is perhaps the most breathtaking example. 2 women of noble birth were interred within it, surrounded by textiles, carved sleighs, and sacred objects. The ship itself, with its coiling dragon-head prow and elaborate carvings, was more than a container. It was a prayer in wood, a hymn carved into curves, an offering to the gods of the sea and sky. To bury a person in a ship was to affirm that life was itself a voyage and that death was not an end, but a continuation upon waters unseen. The symbolism runs deeper still. In Norse mythology, the afterlife was often imagined as a journey. Some spoke of Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, where warriors feasted with Odin. Others told of Hell, a shadowy realm beneath the roots of Yggdrasil. But in either case, the transition from one world to another required movement, a crossing. Just as the sun rode its chariot across the sky, and just as night ferried souls through dream, so too did the dead require a vessel. The longship embodied this cosmic logic. Its curves echoed the womb, its keel mirrored the axis of the world tree. Its sail caught not only earthly winds but the invisible breath of destiny. And yet, the ship was not only for nobles or kings. Even simple cairns, marked with stones in the shape of ships, reveal how deeply the motif of the vessel was woven into the Norse soul. Farmers who never raided, women who never set foot on deck, were still imagined as travelers upon the eternal sea. Death in their vision was not stillness but motion. To live was to sail, to die was to set out on a final voyage. This spiritual dimension also colored the experience of the living crew. When warriors stepped onto the deck, they knew they were already standing in a liminal place, half in this world, half in the next. Every voyage risked death, storms, battles, hunger. Every sail raised was a gamble against fate. Thus the longship itself became a floating ritual, a place where mortality was felt more keenly, where the presence of the gods seemed closer. Songs sung aboard were not only for morale, they were offerings. The rhythm of the oars was a prayer. The creak of timber was the voice of the gods reminding them that all things bend, all things break, all things pass into silence. Even the dragon heads carved at the prow carried spiritual weight. They were not only to terrify enemies but to ward off spirits lurking in the liminal zones of sea and sky. In some cases, these heads were removed before returning home, so as not to carry otherworldly powers into the safety of villages. The ship was a threshold being, part tool, part totem, part temple. To step aboard was to step into myth, to walk where spirits and men intermingled. In this sense, the Viking longship was not unique but part of a greater human pattern. Egyptians buried pharaohs with solar boats to carry them through the underworld. The Greeks imagined Charon ferrying souls across the river Styx. Polynesian navigators saw the canoe as both vessel and ancestor, a living spirit guiding its children across the ocean. Everywhere across cultures and ages, the ship emerges as symbol of passage, of transformation, of transcendence. But among the Norse, this symbolism was carved most vividly into daily life, for they lived with the sea at their doorstep and death as their constant companion. Thus, the Viking longship was not only the soul of raiders, it was the soul of a worldview in which life itself was a voyage toward an unseen shore. To see these vessels as mere instruments of war is to miss their deepest truth. They were temples that floated. They were coffins that breathed. They were poems carved into oak and set loose upon eternity. And when the sails swelled, catching the wind, the Vikings believed that it was not only the ship that moved, but the soul of the warrior, carried closer to the gods. The image of the Viking is forever bound to fire and fury, the torch set to thatched roofs, the axe raised in unyielding wrath, the monk fleeing as iron-shod boots thunder across cloister stones. And yet, if we stop at that vision, we see only half of the story. For just as the longship was born in paradox, both weapon and work of art, so too were the Vikings themselves, both destroyers and creators. Behind every raid lay another truth. These were not only warriors of the storm, but masters of the sea. The longship was the passport through which the Norse entered the vast theater of the medieval world. With shallow hulls and sails that thirsted for wind, they slipped across channels, seas, and rivers that once divided kingdoms. What had been barriers became highways. A river in France led to the heart of the Carolingian Empire. The Volga opened the road to the riches of the East. The North Sea, feared by many, became their arena. With each voyage, they carved a new artery into the body of Europe, pulsing with the blood of trade, tribute, and transformation. Raiding was the beginning, but trading was the destiny. Archaeological evidence speaks louder than saga. Viking hoards are filled not only with silver hacked from churches, but with coins minted in Baghdad, beads from India, silks from Byzantium, amber from the Baltic, furs from the far north. Their ships did not return only with loot, but with stories woven into fabrics, spices that carried the scent of foreign markets, and technologies unseen in the cold fjords of Scandinavia. The longship was not only a predator, it was a bridge between worlds. In Dublin they founded kingdoms. In Normandy they became dukes. In Russia they became rulers, the Rus, whose very name gave birth to a nation. Everywhere they went, they left fragments of themselves, and everywhere they went, they absorbed the lives of others. The Viking Age was not merely a storm passing over Europe. It was a tide that reshaped coastlines, not in sand but in culture. Languages fused, gods mingled, bloodlines intertwined. And the longship, tireless, carried it all across the waves. What made this possible was the unique adaptability of the longship. Other cultures possessed ships, but few possessed vessels that could navigate both ocean and river with equal ease. The Romans had mastered the Mediterranean, but their heavy galleys could never climb shallow streams. The Franks ruled the land with armored knights, but their horses could not swim across seas. The Vikings, with their dragon ships, held both strengths at once. They were amphibians in an age of landlocked beasts. They could strike, retreat, trade, and return before kingdoms even realized the scale of their reach. Yet trade was never only material. Ideas like coins passed from hand to hand. Christianity, though resisted with blood at first, eventually spread through the Norse world, carried as much by missionaries as by merchants. At the same time, the Norse exported their own sagas, their gods, their artistry. Runestones carved in Scandinavia tell of journeys to distant lands, and graffiti scratched into Byzantine walls record the presence of Norse warriors in the emperor's own guard. They were raiders, yes, but they were also storytellers, cultural brokers, translators between worlds. The longship was the beating heart of this exchange. Each voyage carried more than warriors and merchants. It carried identity. It carried transformation. The very design of the ship allowed the Vikings to weave themselves into the fabric of the medieval world. Their sails were like wings stretching across continents, and their oars beat time with the pulse of history. But what perhaps most defined them was the way they viewed this expansion not as betrayal of their roots, but as fulfillment of their fate. The sagas speak of Odin wandering far and wide, of Thor crossing into distant lands, of Loki stirring chaos in foreign courts. The gods themselves were wanderers, travelers across worlds. To take a longship into the unknown was to mirror the divine. The Viking abroad was not an exile, he was a pilgrim of destiny. The paradox was complete. The same vessel that terrified coasts with sudden raids also tied those same coasts into networks of trade and alliance. The longship was at once a blade and a bridge, a symbol of division and of unity. Through it, the Vikings became not just raiders of the north but citizens of the world, and long after their raids ended, long after their kingdoms were absorbed, the cultural web they wove across Europe and beyond continued to hold. Thus, to call the longship merely a war machine is to miss its role as an architect of civilization. For without these vessels, the Vikings would have remained a people at the edges of the world, their sagas confined to icy fjords. But with them, they became participants in the great dialogue of humanity, shaping and being shaped in return. The soul of the longship was not only the soul of raiders, it was the soul of expansion, of curiosity, of exchange. In its timbers echoed not only the cries of battle but the murmur of markets, the songs of foreign tongues, the whispers of gods who demanded not isolation but adventure. And so the dragon ships became not only shadows of terror but also the vessels of transformation, binding together a world that had once believed itself divided. Every civilization leaves behind the ruins of its greatness. Egypt left pyramids of stone. Rome left arches and aqueducts. The Vikings, though less enamored with permanence, left something no less enduring: the memory of their ships. The longship did not survive in walls or marble. It survived in story, in symbol, in the way later generations came to imagine the North and the restless spirit of its people. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was drawing to a close. Christianity spread through Scandinavia, binding the Norse to the rhythms of a new faith. Kings sought to centralize power, outlawing the old ways of private raiding. The dragon-prowed vessels that once darkened the horizons were fewer, their sails lowered as Europe began to harden into states and fortresses. Yet even as the ships themselves dwindled, their shadow lengthened, for to those who had faced them they had already passed into myth. Medieval chronicles speak of the Norse with a mixture of terror and awe. To some, they were the scourge of God, unleashed to punish sinners. To others, they were the embodiment of a freedom and fierceness long since lost in the halls of kings. Their ships, with their elegant lines and haunting figureheads, became symbols not only of danger but of vitality, the wild force of a people unbound by walls or borders. The sagas, written down generations later, preserved this image. In them, ships are never mere background. They are central characters in the unfolding drama. Heroes build ships, name them, sail them into storms as if they were living companions. To lose a ship is to lose a part of one's soul. To bury a leader in one is to affirm his eternal voyage. In literature as in life, the longship was never wood alone. It was myth embodied, a dragon set loose upon sea and sky. Archaeological finds confirmed what the sagas had always hinted. The Oseberg and Gokstad ships excavated from burial mounds astonished the modern world with their craftsmanship. Their curves were not crude but graceful, their carvings not savage but intricate. They were evidence that the Vikings were not merely raiders but artists, visionaries who saw no boundary between beauty and function, between myth and engineering. In museums today, these vessels are revered as masterpieces, silent witnesses to a worldview where life itself was a voyage and the sea its eternal metaphor. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the longship is less material and more spiritual. It is the way it continues to haunt our imagination. Even today, when we speak of freedom, exploration, or the wild spirit of the North, we conjure the image of a dragon-proud ship cutting across the waves. We see in it not only history but archetype, the eternal human longing to leave shore behind, to test the horizon, to seek what lies beyond the known. In this sense, the Viking longship transcends its age. It becomes a symbol of humanity itself, forever torn between destruction and creation, terror and wonder. It reminds us that technology is never only a tool, it is always an expression of the soul that makes it. The longship expressed the Norse spirit, fierce, adventurous, fatalistic, yet profoundly aware that life is a journey upon unstable waters. And as the Viking Age ended, the ships themselves became vessels of memory. No longer raiding, no longer trading, they sailed in the minds of poets and the visions of later generations. They became myths, and myths never die. They live in the marrow of culture, resurfacing whenever humanity feels the call of the sea, the pull of the unknown, the hunger for freedom. Thus, the end of the Viking longship was not an end at all. It was a transformation. The planks rotted, the sails tore, the oars sank into mud, but the symbol endured. It endured in the sagas, in the stones carved with ship shapes, in the graves that still hold their silent keels. It endured in the very idea of the sea as a pathway not only to new lands but to eternity. And so when we stand today before the remains of a longship, we are not only looking at wood, we are looking at a mirror. For in those curved lines, in that dragon's head rising against an invisible horizon, we glimpse ourselves, restless, searching, bound to fate, yet yearning to steer beyond it. The Viking longship is not only the soul of ocean raiders, it is the soul of humanity's unending voyage across the waters of time. The dragon-proud ships no longer cut across the horizon. Their sails no longer catch the cold northern wind. Their oars no longer beat in unison against the tide. And yet, in a way more enduring than wood or iron, they still sail. They sail in our imagination, in the myths we tell, in the way we picture freedom as the act of leaving land behind and steering into the unknown. The longship was never only a vessel. It was a vision. It was the embodiment of a people who saw no separation between war and art, between death and voyage, between the mortal and the divine. It carried raiders to foreign shores, yes, but it also carried souls across the threshold of life and death. It was a coffin, a temple, a bridge, a dragon. It was the paradox of the Norse spirit itself, fierce and fragile, destructive and creative, mortal and eternal. Today, when archaeologists unearth their remains, or when we stand in museums before their restored forms, we do more than study artifacts. We encounter a worldview carved into oak, a philosophy stitched into sail. We remember that the Vikings were not only raiders but dreamers, not only destroyers but builders of connection. Their ships bound together the seas of Europe, tied Scandinavia to Byzantium, wove distant cultures into a single tapestry of exchange. They showed that the sea is never a barrier. It is always a bridge, a truth as old as humanity itself. And beyond history, the longship still whispers a spiritual lesson. It tells us that life itself is a voyage, that we are all passengers on vessels of flesh and spirit, guided by winds we do not always control, rowing together across waters that shift and surge beneath us. It tells us that death is not the end, but the horizon, the place where the known world fades into the unseen. It tells us that every human being, like the Vikings, is called to step onto the deck of uncertainty and trust that the sea, in its fury and its beauty, will carry us toward our destiny. The Viking longship, then, is not only the soul of ocean raiders, it is the soul of humanity's eternal longing for more freedom, more discovery, more life beyond the shore. Its dragon head rises not only against the spray of salt, but against the walls of fear. And its sail even now is filled with the same wind that drives us to seek the mysteries of our own age. So as we leave behind the fjords and the echoes of oars striking water, we carry with us this truth, that the ship still sails, not on the seas of Europe, but on the seas of time. And in its wake it leaves a call to never be content with the land we know, but to venture always toward the horizon that waits, eternal and unknown. And if this journey stirred something in you, a sense of wonder, of mystery, of that restless pull toward the horizon, then let the voyage continue. Join us as we uncover more of the forgotten stories, the hidden symbols, the ancient echoes that still shape our world today. Like the Vikings, we are only ever at the beginning of the next crossing.